we need to reach a time whereby if someone loses, then they accept the loss and move forward.
I think that's the future, but again, I think there's a huge generational divide. So if you look at even in Kenya, the fact that you had these figures who are in their late 60s, early 70s, being the kind of only options sort of speaks to the domination that that generation has over politics across Africa. I mean, one of the interesting things that I discovered in my research is that Africa has the largest age gap between its rulers and its peoples, right? It's something like 42 years. The average
Wow.
African ruler is in his 60s, and the average African is 18, 19 years old. So that's a huge generational divide. I mean, I live in the United States, as I mentioned, and we have our oldest president ever in office, Joe Biden, and he's about 40 years older than the average American, who's in their early 40s. So the average American president, the average African leader, has roughly the same age gap as the current American president has with the American population, but he's actually the oldest American president in history. um, so just to give you a way to think about it, it's quite a vast difference in perspective when you have such older leaders and such a large age gap between the presidents, prime ministers, and the population of these countries.
And these are the leaders who at times don't even understand the changes that are happening, and they don't even see the need to adapt. So it becomes a huge problem.
I think so. I don't think they can adapt. I think that's the basic issue. My mother is 75 years old, and I love her dearly, but I wouldn't want to put her in charge of a country. She's a very capable woman, but there is something about leaving the stage and letting a younger generation come up. And I think one of the big challenges is that many African leaders do not cultivate, their replacements. There's not as much of a desire to kind of give opportunities to young Africans, provide them chances to learn how to rule. And so we sort of have to wait till somebody dies, and then all of a sudden there's a skirmish for who's going to take over, and then usually it's somebody of the same generation as the departed leader. And that's I think a very unfortunate outcome. What we should be doing, especially in a place like Africa, which is the youngest continent in the world by far, is really creating opportunities for young people who I think are going to be at the forefront of every major economic, political, and social transformation that is yet to come.
Why do you think we have the problem of leaders not preparing individuals who take over when they have left? I mean, why do we have such a problem?
Well, I think there's probably a few things. In some ways, obviously, again, because most African countries only gained their independence in the 60s and 70s, many of these leaders were alive. Some of them were actually participants in the anti-colonial struggles as young children. But at the very least, they remember, those days, and they worked within a particular system, usually sort of nationalist anti-colonial parties, which were very hierarchical and very top-down and sort of centered on the idea of the great man, right? The idea that the father of the nation should rule forever. And when the father of the nation goes, then it should be somebody who was very close to the father of the nation who replaces him. And I think that's basically what we've been living through, across Africa, but also really across the post-colonial world for a couple of generations now. And that generation is having a hard time, aging gracefully. I think they don't want to let go of the reins of power, and obviously they've done very well, right? So they may have started as colonial subjects who were subjugated and oppressed by England and other colonial powers, but their rise to power has been accompanied by a tremendous transformation of their economic position. These people have, become massively wealthy by global standards. And so I think there's just this huge disconnect between sort of their perception of their centrality to the nation, their identification with the nation, and the reality that most Africans are young, and many Africans are not able to take advantage of these sort of opportunities or really able to develop economically, because so much of the wealth goes to a very small set of these old elites who have monopolized political and economic power.